Happy New Year, everyone. And I really mean that because even though I think the economy is going to collapse in the next few months, there's going to be a sequence of actions taken by the central bank that will exacerbate will not mitigate the problem, will not solve the problem, which is one created over long term by the central bank, by the Federal Reserve. I still wish everybody a Happy New Year because, even though it's going to be a disaster financially for most Americans in the next year or two, I still wish everybody a happy birthday because we are, there's no reason to be negative about life. It's just that everybody's brainwashed nowadays. Hardly anybody listens. Just watching Peter Schiff on YouTube, on his podcast, that nobody's saying. It was Gundlach, somebody named Gundlach was speaking on CNBC, and he gave a pessimistic report for an hour. But he said, as Peter Schiff said it was glossed over how bad it is, and it's real bad. It's real bad, and the reason it's bad is because the people they they've lost their responsibility for their lives over the last increasingly decades. You have to take responsibility for your life as an individual, and communities have to take their responsibility over centralized powers, centralized governments. And if you don't, those centralized powers will rob you. It's very odd. It's very odd that we think that we can entrust ourselves, our lives with the government. It's a very strange thing. What sort of powers do they have to protect us, to nourish us, to make our lives better? It's just this crazy thing, you know. We send them some money because they force us to send them money at this point. And I suppose in the beginning, it was more or less voluntary. I think the way government started was through conquest. But even then, you have to conquest an existing government. And these centralized powers came around 12,000 years ago, with these kings of England. And not just the 1066 fiasco, but the English kings before the Norman kings took over. So why the hell would you believe these people are going to take care of you? Well, they're going to protect you from foreign invaders and that kind of thing. Yeah, but how vulnerable are you to foreign invaders if they don't have a society that's already centralized? What do they take over? They take over a farm, take over another farm. What are they going to get? They can steal a few things, but they basically want the money. A rich society can't exist without money, because money solves the problem money has a solution called the double coincidence of wants. It's very hard to have a double coincidence of wants in a barter society. Two people are making something and they each want what the other person has. Doesn't happen. That's what money does. It makes sure that somebody has some the other person has. And then in 1971, we no longer had a commodity as money. Nixon took us off the gold standard. And ever since then, it's been downhill because Nixon took us off the gold standard because of all the spending that Johnson did. And and he did too. And then, so the government's been growing ever since because there's been cheap money to pay for it, to finance the deficits. In 1980s, we had better money for a while, but the deficits were still too big. In those days, they were funded by, the debt was bought by Americans because Americans had savings left over from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s because the dollar was still, it was still possible to save, especially because Volcker had high interest rates so that you could afford to save. So the world is full of fools who believe that somehow these power structures that we vote for all the time are not going to continue to rob us, because that's all they are. It's big, giant protection rackets that continue to take money from us, like the gangsters in that movie. What was it? The Bronx Story. Remember that Bronx Story? Of course, there wasn't too much show. They didn't show a lot of that in there, but you get the idea. We're looking at a giant protection racket in government. And we're going to lose our wealth, our capacity to consume, because in the last 30 years, we no longer have saved our own money. And the money is, even if we had saved it, it's going to lose its value. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, is going to destroy the currency. And the reason they're going to destroy the currency is because special interests, vested interests, have a lot of stocks. There's a lot of pensions that have vested interests that are invested in stocks, and a lot of pensions. I can't think of the other thing that might be into stocks. And the stock market, as you all know, is collapsing. So why the hell would you trust this whole system? Well, because you think, well, there's no other way to do it. You have to have a centralized system. And that's a lot of bull hockey. Because you have a certain amount of decentralization as it is, and the point about a voluntary society, which is what, not exactly decentralization, but if society was also voluntary, well, it was decentralized. Well, if it's voluntary, it will be more or less decentralized because centralization doesn't work, because there's no knowledge when you centralize. Centralization is an involuntary phenomenon, right? I mean, you can have large businesses, so therefore there's some centralization going on there, or a large organization that's voluntary, but it's difficult. It's difficult to maintain the necessary information. Centralization is very difficult to maintain the necessary information because life exists at its points. Information is at the point. It's not at the center. Now, there are levels of life that the center and the point, the wholeness and the point are sort of integrated. But we live in a physical world where we don't have the ability to access. We live in a world where we don't have the consciousness to have this infinite correlation. Or if we had the consciousness, nature is by nature, we are decentralized. Why our decision making is decentralized. And, you know, we can be intuitive and subjective in the way we operate. But there's always that element of communication that's necessary to convey the circumstances that are needed. You know, you're building a house or something, and you've got to know the soil conditions before you build the house, right? Or a factory, or you have to know the available materials if you're building something in a factory. All these conditions change, modify, and improve, and decline all the time. So that's what's wrong with centralized control. Not enough information. The other problem with it is it keeps the point, the location, from trying new things. How can the centralized control judge whether you are capable of trying new things? Now, we're not just talking about centralization versus localization. We're talking about voluntarism, control, right, versus control. And so this subjectivity, this insight, this feeling that we get, that we can do things differently. We can invent a new camera, for instance, or a new vehicle, or a new technique for organization, anything. A new science, a new theory. All these inventions that we do, they come out from inside us. Sure, we look around and we talk, and that talking represents conveyance of information, but it's not useful to compare to. It's useful for communication so that we can cooperate, but it's not useful. It's not as powerful or as fundamental as our insights and as our beliefs and as our experience, our subjectivity, to speak more generally. That's what all that entails, right? Is entailed by our subjectivity. That's what the mean subjectivity is. All these processes in our mind, and memories and experiences that develop, and reflections on our actions. Now, what's the other half side of that equation? The other side of that equation of creativity that comes from within is somebody who has devolved their autonomy, and other people who believe in control, and they don't believe in that subjective process, that subjective reality that is really where the location really is, where the information really is, right? Of course, you have these established ways of doing things, but they change all the time. You know, back in the 30s, the economists came out with general equilibrium theory, which is an equation that describes the economy, saying that there's an equilibrium to the economy, and that if you tweak one side or the other of the equation, let's say the money supply or the prices of things in this equation, that you can improve the economy. But of course, that's so totally absurd, because the economy is not driven by actions of the central bank, which can increase the money supply. It doesn't. There's this really stupid idea that you can make the society richer by increasing the money supply. Oh, there's not enough money. We have to have more money. Well, money is it doesn't make you smarter. It doesn't make you work more, right? I mean, you can. I mean, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is, if you increase the money supply, first of all, it isn't going to go to everybody. It's not possible, right? It has to go to vested interests who already have access to the central bank, who is increasing the money supply. And the economy itself has to have it has to be balanced from each individual. He has to have savings. He has to have confidence in the stability of the money value. He has to have confidence in the future in order to invest. Or he has to have the direction to take, because he knows, he can see the trends of the economy for his local situation, right? Or his particular area of interest. If he's in some particular industry, clothing industry, or the electronic industry, or the transportation industry, or the gaming industry, all these industries. And then there's the general awareness that, or the general stability of the market, because everyone in society is doing his own thing. There's no instability. But as soon as you centralize money, then you can create instability. Because as that money supply goes up, which doesn't create more wealth, central bank, that's all banks do. That's all the Federal Reserve does, is create more money or shrink the money supply. That's all it can do, see? But it doesn't know how to do that in order to maintain equilibrium between the present and the future. Because that's what money is for. That's what interest rates are for, to maintain equilibrium. In other words, the price of money is to maintain equilibrium between the present and the future. And that is not known. That's not known by any intellect. That is something that's created by the entire supply and demand of money and supply and demand of goods, which determines what the interest rate is. If there's lots of money around, then the interest rate declines, you see. But if that money doesn't come from demand for money, from savings, then it doesn't reflect what the money is actually worth. Because if there was no demand for the money, because interest rates were artificially low by the central bank, then the savings would not be there. The demand for money would not be there, except by the people who were investing. But the people who were normally saving wouldn't. In other words, the actual relationship between the saver and the investor wouldn't be valid. That's why that's the distortion in the economy. So that's the conceit, as Friedrich Hayek said, of intellectuals, that they think they can control the money supply, that they can pick the interest rates when the supply and demand is not measurable except by those numbers, which you don't know ahead of time. You don't know what that supply and demand is, except as it works, you see. But once Nixon took us off the gold standard, that supply and demand relationship between the demand for money, the desire to save, and the demand for money to invest, which refers to the future, both of those things refer to the future, is once that is interfered with by a central bank, which controls the supply of money, then there's no coordination between the present and the future. And that's why, and that's been going on for 35 years, since Paul Volcker retired and Alan Greenspan took over the Federal Reserve. And guess what? Politicians love cheap money because they don't have to tax the people. They can borrow. And they can afford for a long time to pay the interest. I gotta pause. So they can afford for a long time to pay the interest. And on this spending, on these large, I don't want to use a positive word, this paying off of all the special interests that support them. And the vested interests. So the vested interests are always robbing the people as a whole, because not just through the fact that the cheap money becomes worth less, but also because the relationship between the present and the future is distorted. Savings and investment are not coordinated. And so the investments are fake, they're not real. And so all that money creates a boom, and people are hired, and wages go up, and then there's a bust. Everybody's in bad shape. Plus nobody ever saved because interest rates are so cheap. And that's been going on for 35 years. And that's why we're up shit creek right now, economically. America is up shit creek. The military-industrial complex, all the welfare payments, the security, pension plans like Social Security, all the Medicare and Medicaid, all these things are special interests. They're not. They assume. Politicians always assume something for nothing, and of course that's not something for nothing. It's something for this vested interests and a kick in the ass for real people who actually work and do things. So we're screwed. People are screwed. Even the people who have been making all these trillions of dollars by being invested interests with the government, even a lot of them are going to be screwed. Although a lot of them are actually doing the things that they need to do to protect themselves to some degree. So it's robbery. But there's going to be a lot of disaster on the stocks and on pensions, because pensions are based on tax revenue. Tax revenue is based on the economy. The economy is based on stability, the proper relationship between savings and investment, in other words, through a free market in money, where savings determine the investment and are not artificially determined by our socialist central banking, the Federal Reserve. So people don't realize that the Fed is central banking, is socialism. And so we're basically screwed, because for 35 years, we've weakened the economy. Even before that, we had quite a lot of debt, government debt, but the cheap money for the last 35 years has increased the government debt, increased government promises, the unfunded liabilities, as you've heard, for Social Security, Medicaid, and all that. And, so the basis of the pensions is municipal bonds or government bonds or corporate bonds. And all these things are going to collapse. Anything valued in the American dollar is going to collapse in value. And the American way of life is going to go away. All the discount stores are going to go away, except the ones that sell food and maybe clothing, cheap clothing, not good clothing, because nothing will come from China anymore, because our currency is going to collapse. And no one will be able to afford. We've got much poorer in the last 40, 50 years anyway, right? Back in the old days, mom didn't work because dad had plenty of money. And that's a fact. There's a lot of delusional people that will say, well, no, it's because mom wanted to work, but they wouldn't let her. Women don't like to work. It ain't in their hormones. They like to do domestic stuff. They like people stuff. That's the nature of women. Men like thing stuff. Women, I dig ditches. I get down in the ditches. Sometimes I get down in mud holes. And I learned how to dig deep mud holes. I invented techniques for it without getting down in the mud, because you can't really work good in the mud. You can't get a footing. And you can't get elbow room when you're down in a narrow hole. Big holes you can. Big holes are usually dug by machines anyway, but small ones aren't. Lots of small holes are needed in the world. Until we get more refined machinery, then we'll always have human need for small holes. There ain't no women down in them holes. There ain't hardly any men down in them holes. So, and it's the same with any kind of hard job, And then there is all those executive jobs, those hard driving business jobs, right? Women don't like doing that stuff, pushing. That ain't their nature. Some women are like that, of course. And some men are more domestic. So what? We're talking about overall trends. So we were much richer in the old days. Life was much easier. All you have to do is watch Father's Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver. Life was much easier in those days. And Mom and Dad was always there most of the time. I remember some fatherless homes on my block when I grew up. Not too damn many. It was about maybe 10, 20%, There's always a dad. Dad was always there. It was a different world, Dad. And then, And they always said the left always says tax rates are higher, but that's so disingenuous, it's not funny. Because nobody paid those taxes. The reason they didn't pay them is they had loopholes and deductions. Nobody paid those taxes. So, that's all you're gonna get out of the left is ignorance and lies, mostly ignorance, because I think most of them are sincere. But that's the point. Brainwashing is the prevailing story of the day. And so the 35-year destruction of the dollar took place, and the destruction of the ability of the economy to produce took place, and we've been borrowing from the world ever since, because the world has propped up our ability to consume and to have a service economy, which is not a real economy, for that 35-year period. It's propped up that ability. And it's getting ready to drop it, because the longer we don't pay off our debts, and we're not going to pay off our debts. Only a goofball thinks we're going to pay off our debts. They admitted 10 years ago, they announced that if we don't get our loans, people don't buy our bonds, we're not going to pay them back. In other words, they admitted it's a Ponzi scheme. We'll never pay them back. So the world's going to drop us. They're going to take their losses and drop us. People are going to stop. The central banks of the world will stop punishing their own people in order for us to perpetuate our credit-based economy, cheap money economy. Because everybody's brainwashed into thinking the government is the solution. In fact, government has destroyed much of the black culture in America. It's destroyed the white culture, for that matter. Because the people do not want to be self-reliant. And they're brainwashed in school from the time they're 4 or 5 years old. And these stupid teachers, these stupid government teachers, repeat the exclusive ability, the myth that only the government can take care of you, only we're taking care of you. They're not taking care of us, they're making us weaker and weaker. They're destroying the family. Women's lib is really evil. It's really evil, the way it's manifested. And of course, all the people who were murdered in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. It's all going to come back to bite us in the ass. Stupid, rotten dependencies on illusions, on the illusion that somebody's going to, at a distance, is going to take care of us. Because, after all, they're well educated, right? They're real good at education, real sharp at academia. I was never good at academia. I mean, I was good enough to get my bachelor's and my master's degrees, and score a few grades here and there. But no. I think outside the box. You go to academia, you think way inside the box, and then you ignore your intellect. You think your intellect is enough to organize society, and that the people are too dumb to live their own lives. Take the example of a public library. What, 10% of the people use a public library, and 100% pay for it. Yeah, but the rest of them, they don't know what they're doing. They should be paying for this public library. And whoever they use that money for to do on their own, it's inferior. See? In other words, the intellectuals don't want people to mind their own damn business. They don't want people to live where they are. They want them to live in an artificially, impossibly destructive world. So that's where we're at. We're screwed. The intellectuals and the lack of self-reliance on the part of the people have screwed us. Enjoy your next year. Happy New Year.